Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the statehood era, or the journey towards statehood. This and subsequent lectures will cover the period 1853, when Washington became its own territory, all the way until 1889, when Washington becomes a state. In this lecture, we will talk about the economic development of Washington, immigration to Washington, but also always keeping in mind the overall immigration trends within the United States that are going on at this same time period. And then we'll also talk about some disturbing national policies that had specific impact and significance in Washington itself. Now, before we get going, I just want to make a quick apology. I've been under the weather a little bit lately. My voice probably sounds a little bit different and stranger than it did before. You might hear me cough a couple times in this lecture. I tried very hard to have to wait to record these until I was feeling better. But at the end of the day, I just kind of ran out of time. So my apologies for having to hear me somewhat sick as I'm delivering these lectures. All right. So one thing you need to keep in mind as we're moving forward and having this conversation is what the United States Army had described at the time as the pacifying of the West. And Washington, of course, was part of the West. And that is the ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples from their homelands to be placed on reservations, either by treaty agreement and or by war and warfare, ultimately resulting in reservations throughout the state of Washington. Now you can see here the modern day reservations in the state of Washington. You can see how numerous they are. Well, in the time period we're talking about, they were actually even larger. These reservations are reduced in size from by basically 2/3 of what they used to be. And we'll talk later in this unit why that is. But keep in mind, this is a parallel story going on in the region, which is that we've already covered the Indian conflicts, the wars that happened here, and why. We did that in the previous unit. That's a parallel story to the story of immigration and economic development that we're going to be building in these lectures in this particular unit. So you must keep that in mind. So Washington is its own territory. Both the residents of Washington and the federal government really wanted to accelerate the process by which Washington go from territory to statehood. And that meant enticing people to Washington. In 1850, when Washington was still part of the Oregon country, part of Oregon territory, there had been an act passed called the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act. We talked about that, which is that single white men were given 320 acres of land if they were to settle and quote unquote improve it, which just meant living on it, farming it, logging it, doing something with it to support themselves. And married couples got 640 acres. That land distribution, or more appropriately, redistribution from indigenous peoples, because it had been their land, to the settlers of Washington, who were predominantly white because African Americans were denied westward migration for reasons we talked about in the previous unit. So that transfer of land and wealth from the indigenous peoples to white American citizens was seen as a model that should be applied to the rest of the American West. So in 1862, which is during the Civil War, Lincoln signs into law the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act basically does the same thing, but on a smaller scale. So the Homestead Act said 160 acres for single white men and 320 acres for married couples. And so the Homestead Act became the new, apologies, the new land law that transferred land from indigenous peoples to white Americans throughout the American West, including in Washington. Now, the Homestead Act acted as a catalyst for lots of people to move west and claim land. It acted as a real catalyst. Between 1843 and 1869, these are the dates of the Oregon Trail's operation. 1843 is what we talked about, the first wagon train across. 1869 is the end of the use of the trail, primarily because of the coming of railroads, which we'll talk about later in this unit. Um, but between 1843 and 1869, 400 to 600,000 people made this journey across to the west. And a large chunk of them were taking advantage of these acts, especially the Homestead Act. And it was an enticement to get a lot of settlement. However, it's important to know, and we'll talk about this in a moment, Washington had limited success with the Homestead Act, and we'll explain some of that in just a little bit. But that was the enticement to get people to move west. Now, the first phase of westward migration, which took advantage of the Oregon Trail, were a little bit of a struggle because the trail itself wasn't very friendly to people moving out west. By the time you get to the 1850s, the trail does improve, and there are technological innovations that make life on the trail a little bit easier, and the trail became more adaptable. And what I mean by that is, initially the trail just went from Missouri to Fort Vancouver, Oregon City, that kind of area. And then eventually what happened was branches off the main trail were developed to get to California or to Nevada or to Montana or directly to Oregon, but bypassing parts of what is now Washington. So all these splinter trails developed. Also shortcuts developed, most famously one called the Sublette Cutoff, which was physically demanding, but if you could do it, it cut something like 40 days off the trail. And then wagon technology just got better. The original wagons that they used on the Oregon Trail were wagons that had been designed for transportation in the eastern United States. And in the eastern United States, the wagons tended to have a narrower wheelbase. And those wagons tended to break down on the Oregon Trail. So they developed wagons with a wider wheelbase. They developed axle technology that was more suited to the grind and of traveling across the plains and the Rocky Mountains. And so basically the trail got better for migrants on the trail as you get closer. And that's really what enables it to be used so successfully by between 400 and 600,000 people. But even though it's used by 400 to 600,000 people, that's still kind of a drop in the bucket. It's really not that many people overall. So let's talk about what happens when those individuals get into Washington. So in spite of the incentives, right, the land giveaways, Washington's population, grew very slowly. In 1850, about 1,201 people lived in Washington territory. Now, let me just make a comment about that. That is white American citizens. That does not include a census of the indigenous population, which we would have known measured in the hundreds of thousands, if not more, right? This does not include indigenous peoples. The reason for this is that under American law and jurisprudence, Native peoples are left out of the Constitution. They are not considered American citizens. The status of Native Americans is pretty ambiguous under the Constitution. In Article 1 of the Constitution, there are clauses that refer to tax-paying Indians and authorize Congress to create agreements with the tribes. And by the 19th century, how this was understood was that Native peoples were a separate people within the United States, but who were not governed by its laws, entitled to its protections, nor counting towards American citizenship for voting or anything like that. So indigenous peoples were othered and considered a nation within a nation under 19th century American law. It was understood explicitly that they were to be left out of the Constitution by what was written in Article 1. And then the courts had furthered that conversation throughout the 19th century. As a consequence, when the United States is performing its census in 1850, it's not going to count indigenous peoples because that population doesn't matter for the purposes of American government and governing and allocation of assets and so on and so forth, allocation of political lines, all those kinds of things. So, 1850, 1,201 people living in Washington Territory, white American citizens. In 1860, right, 10 years later, that population has only budged about 9,000 people. It's not that much. Part of the reason for that was twofold. First, the geography of Washington Territory did not lend itself easily to homesteading. It did not lend itself easily to homesteading. So the kinds of lands that were claimed as a consequence of the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act, and also later in 1862, the Homestead Act, Washington did not have the types of geography that were conducive to a lot of homesteading. Secondly, and related, there wasn't enough infrastructure out here in Washington in order for homesteading to be successful. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the kinds of homesteading that was done in the 19th century was either ranching or you're talking about grains, primarily wheat. There could be other kinds of homesteading, but that was your primary two agricultural industries, ranching and dryland wheat. Washington has geography suitable for that in the sense that we have plenty of grazing land and we have plenty of land suitable for dryland farming. Because, of course, we have lots of dryland farming today in this state. Dryland wheat farming in particular we have in this state in abundance, especially in eastern Washington. But there wasn't the infrastructure to get agricultural products to market. There was no way to get our agricultural goods that would be produced here by homesteaders to markets where they could be consumed. And there weren't large cities that were demanding agricultural goods from the local farmers. So for instance, at this time, the biggest city in the 1850s and 60s, the biggest city in Washington is actually Walla Walla. And outside of Walla Walla, there was dryland farming at this time. And there was ranching in places because there was a town that needed that produce, needed those things. But Walla Walla wasn't a large urban place. And as a consequence, the infrastructure wasn't in place to take Washington goods too far outside of that. And so, because of the geography of Washington, its remoteness from most population centers, the lack of infrastructure that existed to get Washington farm produce to market, and by markets I mean markets in the West where there were larger urban centers or back east. Those markets just didn't exist. And then added to that, the harsh geographic conditions that you often find in the state of Washington and within Idaho, which was part of Washington Territory at this time, which made it very difficult to homestead. Well, you just had this situation where there were other places that were considered more enticing. There were other places that were considered more enticing for the purposes of doing homestead land. Excuse me. Added to that was limited mineral potential. Washington didn't have the same mineral wealth that places in Nevada and California, for instance, or Colorado did. So, As a consequence of that, Washington developed a experience in the history of the West that was actually quite different from much of the rest of the American West. It was an experience, frankly, shared by Oregon and to a certain extent California. But most of the time, when we think of the West, we think of a very rural homesteading pioneer experience. By contrast, in Washington, most residents live in towns and cities for all the reasons I just mentioned, which means that Washington will have a higher percentage of its population in urban centers than lots of other places in the American West. That's something to keep in mind as we move forward from this point, because urban centers often develop economic and political experiences that are different than rural areas. And it might help in part to explain why Washington's political decisions, political experiences, political preferences have placed it more in line with states back east as opposed to states in the West. It's something we'll be talking about. But as we move forward from this point on, just remember, beginning the territorial period, because of Washington's geography and the lack of infrastructure, there tended to be more of a town and urban experience in Washington's 19th century story than most other places in the West. But it's also important to keep in mind that you have the largest communities in Washington are Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver, Everett, Walla Walla, Spokane. But most of these towns were not very big because there's not that many people out here to begin with. But those who are out here are living in towns and cities. Now, let's talk about who these people are. Pardon me. In some cases, right, they are simply Americans from other parts of. Rephrase this. They are people who've been American citizens for decades. So they are people who've been American citizens for decades, and their families have been American citizens, and their parents, their grandparents, their great grandparents, etc., were American citizens. So these are people who have a long history of American citizenship in their family who have decided to move west looking for new opportunity. That is a large portion of the immigrants who have moved to Washington Territory. However, we are starting to see in the 1860s and 70s immigrants from other places around the world moving into Washington Territory. So we're seeing Scandinavian immigrants, we're seeing Irish immigrants, we're seeing some Italian immigrants, and these are individuals who are either immigrants themselves, or they are first generation Americans who maybe lived for a while in the eastern United States and then moved west. But whatever the case is, they are adding diversity to the population of Washington Territory. Washington Territory will end up with a more diverse population than most of the rest of the West, particularly the Rocky Mountain West. When you get to places like Oregon and California, that diversity of experience will be shared. But compared to the Intermountain West, it is a different story because of the diverse nature of the population that begins to move out here. And that will only accelerate in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and into the early 1900s, as we will talk about in subsequent lectures. Now, one thing I want to point out, there is a small Chinese immigrant population dating back to the 1860s. That's going to grow in the 1870s and into the 1880s. So you should be aware of that. And the growth in Washington Territory is going to be paralleled with growths in other areas of the West. We'll talk more about the Chinese immigrant experience in subsequent lectures, but I want you to be aware of it because it's going to be a really, really important part of the story, okay? A very important part of the story. Lastly, African Americans were denied the right to move out west in the 1850s and 1860s, so prior to the Civil War. They were forbidden to move out west, and they were denied the right, if they came out here, to claim land under the various federal programs. But that doesn't mean that African Americans did not come out west. We know that they did, and many of them came to Washington Territory. So it's not a large population, but there is a small population that does exist. I want to talk to you briefly about urban life in Washington Territory, because these cities and towns are different from today. They're towns mostly made of wood, right? They're made of wood, which means they're very, very prone to fire, and they're very, very prone to catastrophic fire. In fact, lots of towns and cities in Washington burned down during the territorial period, including the city of Seattle. And so fire was never present danger in towns made primarily of wood. There are dirt streets. There's no real lighting or even gas lights out here. That was just a technology that didn't exist in abundance in Washington. Most towns exist by charter from the territorial government, so they apply to be incorporated under the territorial government. If accepted, then they are allowed to form municipal governments. These municipal governments were important because they were the type of government that residents here had the most democratic control over. So the type of government that residents here had the most democratic control over. If you recall, residents here could elect to the territorial legislature, but they couldn't elect the territorial executive branch. And they couldn't elect the territorial court system. They could elect a single representative to be a spokesperson for the territory in Congress, but they had no voting power and impact in Congress. And therefore, their votes, they had no say in the federal government. They couldn't vote for members of the House. Their territorial legislature did not get to appoint anyone to the Senate. Just so you know, the Senate is not directly elected at this time. That will come in with the 17th Amendment. We'll talk about that later on. This time, members of the Senate, so every state's 2 senators, are elected or appointed by the state legislature. That's how it was under the original writing of the Constitution, and therefore you have to be a state to have senators in order for your legislature to be able to appoint. So Washington doesn't get to elect members of the House. They don't have a state legislature that appoints to the Senate, and they have no vote for the president, and they have no electoral college votes towards the president. So residents who move out here have very little political power over either the federal or the territorial government. By contrast, municipal governments are places where they can have a certain amount of control, and therefore that created an emphasis on civic life in these towns. Members of these towns were hugely involved in local politics. And that's not to suggest that people weren't involved in local politics back east. They certainly were. And in some places like New England, there was an intensity to it. But in Washington Territory, as in other territories in the American West, there was an intensity to involvement in local government simply because of the reality of their political lives and political participation because they were territories. So municipal governments will develop law enforcement, they'll develop fire departments because fire is never present danger. Municipal government will be quite active. The one thing that municipal governments tended to not have was schools. Public education was not very common in Washington Territory. So every community had churches, and churches were important for social life and cultural life within a community. And those churches tended to operate schools that sometimes received money from the local government to educate children. But these churches, were not public schools in of themselves. But they did operate schools, sometimes with the tax assistance of local government in order to provide education for the population out here, because without state government, there was no mechanism for creating state public education. Let's talk a little bit about the economic activity in early Washington territory. So economic activity out here is largely resource-based, natural resource-based. It's about industries that exploit the resources that are here. And so there are effectively four industries: agriculture, fishing, mining, and timber. On this slide, we'll talk about agriculture and fishing. So most agriculture in the state of Washington was subsistence. It was subsistence farming where the farmers are growing what they need to survive, or they might grow for the local town. But large-scale commercial farming is not possible yet because there's really not much of the infrastructure in place nor a population in place that would allow for it. However, there are two important exceptions to that. One, there is a healthy ranching industry in Washington. It's primarily happening in north central Washington, especially on the Waterville Plateau and the Wenatchee Valleys. They were big ranching areas during the 1850s and 60s. They were actually pretty good ranching areas in the 1870s and 80s. Pardon me. So they were ranching. And so what would happen is the cattle would be grazed on the lands in north central Washington, the Waterville Plateau or the Wenatchee Valley. And they would use the water resources, the lakes or the river or ponds or streams or snow runoff, etc. And then when it was time for slaughter, the animals would be driven either to Walla Walla or to Spokane. Sometimes they'd be driven over the mountains towards the Puget Sound because those were your markets, okay? And the cattle industry continued to be really important in north central Washington until some of the winters in the 1880s and 1890s were so bitterly cold that the cattle just died, and that made dryland farming considered a safer bet for your agricultural industry. So dryland farming is the other big industry here. It's mostly wheat. They did some other like barley and some other dryland crops, but mostly it was wheat. This was limited at the time because there were no railroads. Without the railroads, you couldn't just dryland farm wherever the soil and the climate were conducive to it and then ship that grain to the nearest market. You had to be pretty close to markets. So most of dryland farming in the state at the time was taking place either in the Puget Sound because they got enough moisture that you didn't need, you could grow a variety of crops with a cooler environment and more moisture. And then you had population centers in the Puget Sound you could take advantage of. Or in southeastern Washington around Walla Walla, a little bit outside Spokane. That was it. Perhaps the biggest industry in early Washington was fishing. Fishing was an enormously important economic industry in early Washington because, as going back to the times of exploration in James Cook, there was an abundant fish in the Puget Sound and in the Pacific Ocean just right off the coast of Washington Territory. And fish were one of those, were a product that didn't require refrigeration. So most meat, unless it was salted or preserved in some way, would go bad after a while. By contrast, fish, if you can fish appropriately, canned fish could last for a very long time. And canned fish was increasingly becoming a popular part of people's diet in the industrial cities of the eastern United States and the industrial cities of Europe. And so what happened is that canning techniques developed to be able to preserve fish for a very, very long time. And in the 1860s, the canning industry in the United States begins to take off, specifically in Washington. Now, canning in Washington took place in two different areas. One was the Puget Sound, where these canneries developed. And so what happened is fishermen would go out and fish. They'd harvest as many fish as possible. They also did oysters as well. And then they would bring them back to the cannery where they would be processed, put into cans, steamed, put into cases, and then they could be shipped. The other area this happened was along the mouth of the Columbia River. So in both the Oregon and the Washington side, all the way up to Vancouver. So that was another area where this activity took place. By 1868, there were 18,000 cases of canned salmon alone being produced in Washington Territory. And if you add in other types of fish and shellfish, the number accelerates. And the demand is only growing. With the demand growing, you need labor. And so the canning industry is looking for workers. Initially, the canning industry tried to recruit local indigenous peoples to work in the canneries. And some did, many did. But increasingly, what happened is the canneries were not looking to pay good wages. And so they couldn't attract a lot of the they couldn't attract a lot of the white immigrants because they weren't looking to pay living wages that white immigrants were willing to work for or would work for or even could work for. So then they started looking for marginalized populations that they could exploit. They originally tried indigenous peoples. After that didn't work out quite so well, they then turned to exploiting immigrant labor from China. And these immigrants were heavily marginalized, heavily discriminated against, and with very little options for work, they had to take whatever work was offered them. And increasingly, after the railroads, so Chinese immigrant labor was used to build some of our early transcontinental railroads. After those were completed, those workers were looking for other jobs because of racism, prejudice, and discrimination, as we'll talk about in subsequent lectures. They couldn't get work anywhere else, and so they ended up in Washington and in Oregon in the canning industry. And there they worked for abysmal wages because they had no other alternative to demand higher wages, and they often had no other jobs that anyone would hire them for because of racism and discrimination. So they often worked in abysmal conditions for abysmal wages. Then the populations around them hated them for working for so little and were prejudiced against them for racist and other reasons. And so we'll talk about that in subsequent lectures. But this canning industry is what's going to draw Chinese immigrant labor to the Washington Territory. And as a consequence, right, there is going to be a population of Chinese heritage here. And we need to think about that and talk about that and particularly discuss the racism that they will experience. But we'll do that in subsequent lectures. Let's talk about mining. Pardon me. In the 1850s and 1860s, gold prospectors from California, once the California gold rush began to die out, began to drift north and begin to look for gold. Between 1852 and 1855, as we talked about in our lecture on Indian conflicts, they did discover gold near Colville. It wasn't much, but there did become a mining industry. In the 1860s, gold was discovered near Lewiston, Idaho. And the closest town to that was Walla Walla. So that spurred a lot of development in Washington. There was also silver mining in what is now northern Idaho, and that had a benefit to the economic and population growth of Spokane. So there will never be large mineral wealth in Washington Territory for the kinds of minerals that were popular in the 19th century, primarily gold and silver. So mining in Washington Territory in 19th century terms will never take off. Now later, there will be some minerals and items that can be mined in Washington that are useful for industrial processes. And so that will then result in mining industry beginning to take off in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, we just didn't have the kinds of of minerals that 19th century prospectors were looking for. Timber, like fishing, was a pretty big growth industry in Washington Territory during the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Timber products were in high demand across Europe, the European countries' empires, and also the Eastern United States. And primarily because in Europe, there had been large levels of deforestation. And so they needed timber for lots of different kinds of industrial goods. In the Eastern United States, a very similar story, that there had been widespread deforestation in lots of the Eastern United States, and so there was a need for timber products from other areas. One of the ironies is that if you go back east to the Eastern United States today, you'll see lots of forest, particularly in the Northeast. And during the fall, you get the beautiful colors and all those kinds of things, and the fall color season. It's something that the Northeast, and particularly New England, is known for. But ironically, that's only something that's come back over the last, say, 100, 120 years or so, because they became so deforested that logging industries just left. And as a consequence, the trees came back. And then some of it was deliberate efforts by conservationists to bring trees back. But at the end of the day, that wasn't the case in the late 19th into the early 20th century, where there just wasn't enough of the required lumber for a timber industry. But Washington Territory did have it. And in particular, Washington benefited from the California Gold Rush. The city of San Francisco basically grew overnight because of the California Gold Rush. And it was a city built of timber. Well, that timber came from the Puget Sound. In fact, many of the California boom towns were built with timber from the Puget Sound. So much so that in 1853, a man named Henry Yesler built the first steam-powered mill in the territory. By 1860, there were 25 such mills in the Puget Sound. Seattle was originally a lumber town. Now, today, people think of Seattle as high tech. You know, Seattle's had many different identities over the years, from aerospace town to a high tech coffee town, which is how we kind of think of it today. But originally, it was a lumber town, and it was the first of many lumber towns that began to emerge all over Western Washington. And so, one of the benefits of Washington lumber is, since it didn't have to be preserved like food products, the lumber could be processed here and then sent kind of wherever it was needed. And Washington timber products were shipped all over the globe. And particularly, they were popular in areas of the British Empire, like Australia, where there was high demand for timber products from the Pacific Northwest. That was kind of the closest place for them to get some of these timber products. So it was truly one of the most important economic industries, and we'll start drawing immigrants out here. All right, there is your look at the economic industries of Washington Territory. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the transformative role that railroads played in the story of Washington Territory. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.